The River class was a class of 6 torpedo-boat destroyers operated by the Royal Australian Navy. Ran. Based on the British Acheron class. A batch of 3 ships was ordered for the Commonwealth Naval Forces in 1909, followed later by a second batch of 3. All 6 vessels are named after Australian rivers. The rivers saw service during World War I. Ships of the class participated in the Australian naval and military expeditionary force capture of German New Guinea, and performed patrols in Australian and Malayan waters. In 1917, the class was deployed as a single unit to the Mediterranean, and assigned to anti-submarine patrols of the Adriatic. The destroyers returned to Australia in 1919, and were placed in reserve. All 6 ships of the class were disposed of by the 1930s. 3 were sold for use as accommodation hulks, 2 to the NSW Penal Department, the 3rd to Cockatoo Island Dockyard, and later sank. The other 3 were sunk as target ships. The bow and stern sections of HMAS Parramatta were recovered in 1973 and are preserved as memorials. Design and construction. Based on the British Acheron class. The destroyers of this class had a displacement of 750 tons. The first 3 had a length overall of 246 feet, 75 meters, while the second 3 were longer at 250 feet 9 inches, 76.43 meters. They were powered by 3 oil-burning Yarrow boilers connected to Parsons turbines, which delivered 10,000 shaft horsepower, 7,500 kilowatts, to 3 propeller shafts. Cruising speed was 11.5 knots, 21.3 kilometers per hour, 13.2 miles per hour, giving the ship a range of 2,690 nautical miles, 4,980 kilometers, 3,100 miles. And maximum speed was 26 knots, 48 kilometers per hour, 30 miles per hour. Each ship's company consisted of between 66 and 73 personnel, including 5 officers. The destroyer's main armament consisted of a single BL 4-inch Mark 8 naval gun, supplemented by 3 QF 12-pounder 1200-weight naval guns. They were also fitted with 3 303-inch machine guns and 3 single 18-inch torpedo tubes. The first 3 ships, Parramatta, Yarrow and Warrego, were ordered for the Commonwealth Naval Forces, the post-Federation amalgamation of the Australian colonial navies, on 6 February 1909. Another 3 ships, Huon, Swan, and Torrens, were ordered later, on the advice of the British Admiralty. The ships were named after Australian rivers, one from each state. Although the original intention of using rivers with Aboriginal name origins did not carry through to the second batch, Senator George Pearce requested that they instead be named after famous navigators, but was overruled by Prime Minister Alfred Deakin. Huon was originally to be named Derwent, but this was changed before launch to avoid confusion with the British E-class, formerly River class, destroyer HMS Derwent. Parramatta and Yarrow were the first new ships launched for the Australian Navy. After completion, the 2 vessels were temporarily commissioned into the Royal Navy for the delivery voyage to Australia, although they reverted to the control of the Commonwealth Naval Forces on arrival in Broome. Warrego, however, was built up to launch condition, then disassembled, transported to Australia by ship, and rebuilt at Cockatoo Island Dockyard. The reasoning behind this was to raise the standard of the Australian shipbuilding industry by giving Cockatoo Island hands-on experience in warship construction. The second batch of 3 warships were all built at Cockatoo Island. Operational history. The first 3 destroyers were operating with the Australian fleet of the start of World War I. The 3 ships were assigned to the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, and participated in the capture of German New Guinea. After the conclusion of the campaign, the destroyers were assigned to home waters for a short period, then assigned to Malayan and surrounding waters until late 1916. During August and September, the second group of River-class destroyers began relieving the ships of the first group from Malayan patrols, with Parramatta, Yarra, and Warrego returning to Australia. In July 1917, all 6 ships rendezvoused off the Cockatoo Islands, the first time the entire class had been in one location. From there, the River-class destroyers proceeded to the Mediterranean. On arrival at Malta, they were immediately deployed as escorts for a convoy. After this, the destroyers were modified for anti-submarine warfare. The aftmost torpedo tube was removed and replaced with depth-charge rails. From August 1917, the 6 destroyers were based at Brindisi, Italy, assigned to patrol the Adriatic and prevent enemy submarines using it as a route to the Mediterranean. After a brief refit and leave period in England after the war's end, and the reinstallation of their torpedo tubes at Malta, the 6 destroyers returned to Australian waters in March 1919. They were placed in reserve, and had all been disposed of by the 1930s. Decommissioning and Fate. After decommissioning, Parramatta and Swan were stripped down and sold to the NSW Penal Department for use as prisoner accommodation on the Hawkesbury River. The 2 hulks were then sold into private hands. After plans to use them as fishers' accommodation, they were used to transport metal to islands along the river. In 1934, Swan and Parramatta were being towed along the river to the shipbreakers when heavy weather caused the hulks to break free of their towing vessel. Swan sank, and Parramatta ran aground. The 2 ships were abandoned, although in 1973, the bow and stern of Parramatta were salvaged for use as memorials. Warrego was used as accommodation at Cockatoo Island. She sank at her berth, and was later demolished. Yarra, Torrens, and Huon were all scuttled outside Sydney Heads after being used as target ships. Ships of the class. Citations. Books. Bastock, John. 1975. Australia's Ships of War. Cremorne. NSW. Angus and Robertson. ISBN 0207129274. OCLC 2525523. Castles. Vic. 2000. The Destroyers. Their Battles and Their Badges. East Roseville. NSW. Simon & Schuster. ISBN 0-7318-0893-2. OCLC 46829686. Clark, Chris. 2005. Stevens, David. Reeve, John. eds. The Navy and the Nation. The Influence of the Navy on Modern Australia. Crow's Nest. NSW. Allen and Unwin. ISBN 1-74114-208. OCLC 67872922. Stevens, David. 2001. Stevens, David. ed. The Royal Australian Navy. The Australian Centenary History of Defence. Volume 3. South Melbourne. Vic. Oxford University Press. ISBN 0-19555542-2. OCLC 50418095. Journal articles. Perryman, John. February 2007. Naming of RAN ships. Semaphore. Sea Power Centre Australia. 2007. 4. Retrieved 8 May 2015. Acheron and River-class destroyers at Battleships Cruises website.